After being eliminated in the second round in disappointing fashion and losing Kentavious Caldwell-Pope to free agency, the highlight of the Nuggets offseason was signing a 35-year-old Russell Westbrook. Considering how things have turned out for him in his last few stops, many are willing to write this move off entirely. But is there a chance that this signing could actually make the team better? The biggest concern everyone has is, of course, the spacing. It sort of goes without saying, but it's important to emphasize that Russ is a complete non-threat to shoot the three ball, and he's treated as such. Whenever he doesn't have the ball, he's typically left open, oftentimes as an intentional focus within the opponent's defensive scheme, and he simply cannot make them pay. Over the last 3 seasons, he made just 32% of his wide open threes, good for the 18th percentile among all players, and it was an even worse 29.4% off the catch, landing him in just the 9th percentile. Now, typically when you have a guy like this, the goal is to surround him with nothing but shooters. That just isn't how the Nuggets roll though. As a team, they attempted just 32 threes every 100 possessions, which ranked 27th in the league. And to make matters even worse, they lost their 3rd best shooter in free agency and replaced him in the starting lineup with yet another guy who isn't much of an outside threat. So what was already a big weakness, 3-point volume, could become an even bigger weakness to the point where there's a very serious chance that this team is dead last in 3-point attempts. Considering how important the 3-point line is and space to operate in general, this is a pretty big deal. However, while many will take those facts into consideration and immediately write off the move as a desperate attempt to remain in contention, there are so many different areas on the court that Westbrook can still impact. For starters, in addition to a lack of 3-point volume, the Nuggets were actually dead last in drives per game at 37.4. Generating rim pressure is one of the most important qualities an offense can have, and Denver has that, but not in the traditional sense. With Jokic operating up top as a playmaking stretch 5, the floor does open up for rim attacks, typically off the ball. Lots of screening, cutting, and offensive rebounding to still generate those high efficiency shots. Yet, as we saw in that Minnesota series, when you run into a paint-oriented defense that can take away those actions and prevent passes from getting near the basket, it sort of stalls the system, forcing the offense to either run through a heavy diet of tough jumpers or just a ton of Jokic post-ups as he tries to take on the defense by himself. In other words, their ability to pressure the rim was pretty much nullified, and it was a result of not having the type of slasher that's needed to break down a high-level defense. What you're looking at is the amount of shots each Nuggets player took at the rim every 75 possessions, and what percentage of those shots were assisted. For reference, here's the league's average from last year. Anything to the right of that mark is above average in volume, and anything below it is less assisted shots. Of course, Aaron Gordon was their biggest interior presence, but he's the biggest beneficiary of those cuts and quick duck-ins underneath the basket. Jokic is the one guy who produces a very healthy mark, well above average in both categories, and their guard rotation of Murray and Jackson of course handled the ball enough to generate unassisted buckets, only at about an average rate though, as they're both pretty jump shot heavy. Now here's where Westbrook landed last season, bringing a completely different dynamic to Denver's offense. This right here is his most valuable trait as a player. Even at age 35, he remains incredibly explosive on the floor and just knows how to use his body to consistently get in the defense. With that said, I'm sure another concern many have is his tendencies out of those drives. And I get it, he's known to take some very questionable mid-range pull-ups, awkward floaters, and doesn't have great touch around the rim as a finisher. It's very important to keep in mind though that even a low percentage shot at the rim is a high percentage shot overall. The league's average percentage at the rim was over 66%, while Russ shot about 60%. And I think there are two completely different ways of interpreting that number. You could look at it and say Westbrook shot 6% below average at the rim. He simply isn't an efficient finisher. I prefer to frame it like this. Westbrook generates 60% shots at a very high volume. The defense has to react to that, and he uses that pressure to unlock his most important skill. If you're picking up on what I'm getting at, his ability to get to the rim, when coupled with his all-time great passing, allows him to create a lot of quality offense for teammates. That brings me back to what I said about the Nuggets lacking shooters. How valuable is a drive and kick if it's ending up in the hands of a weak perimeter option? Well, it's a good thing then that his best passes aren't kickouts. Where he excels is on those quick dump-offs to rolling bigs, or leaving his feet and drawing a shot blocker while airborne before laying it down to a cutter or vertical spacer. As a result, every big he's ever played with has reaped amazing benefits. If we use the last 4 years as a sample, there have been 6 bigs who have played at least 400 minutes with him on the floor and 400 minutes with him on the bench. Of those 6, every single one saw an increase to their amount of shots at the rim except for Anthony Davis, which I think depicts my point fairly well. But even more so than generating high quality shots at the rim, Westbrook is one of the best we've ever seen at generating high quality shots in that short mid-range area. You know those touch shots that a lot of bigs like to go to, whether it's a floater, a hook, that 5 to 14 foot shot that 7-footers will use to get the ball up over shot blockers. Again, if we use the last 4 years and set a minimum of 40 attempts both with and without Russ, the impact is obvious. Robin Lopez shot 3.5% better. Thomas Bryant shot nearly 23% better. Anthony Davis about 6% better. And Zubac, who lives in this area of the floor, saw an increase of almost 8%. The reason I think this is so important within the context of the Nuggets is that Jokic was already the best in the league at this shot before ever playing with Russ. Here's a look at the short mid-range scoring of every player in the NBA last season. Zubac was number 1 in efficiency thanks to a combination of amazing touch and the creation of Russ, while Jokic was number 2 in efficiency but also number 4 in volume, a clear outlier. Jokic's touch on floaters is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's like he has a layup from as far out as 15 feet, and we might just see that taken to another level this season. Most of these shots come out of the two-man game with Jamal, and he gets a decent amount of touches as a roller, but to me, it's pretty clear that Murray's a score-first attacker and would rather call his own number as a pull-up shooter. So if nothing else, I believe the two-man game between Russ and Joker will only lead to more of those mid-range layups. It isn't just bigs that Russ makes an impact on though. His own ability to get to the rim at volume, when paired with his eye for cutters, rollers, and everything in between, has a clear impact on the team's interior scoring as a whole. Again, he's made 3 stops in the last 4 seasons. Washington attempted about 1 more shot at the rim every 100 possessions with Russ. The Lakers jumped by more than 4 attempts, and the Clippers followed suit at about 3.5 attempts. Like I said earlier, the Nuggets generate a lot of rim pressure, nearly 30 shots at the rim every 100 possessions. All of that cutting, screening, those Jokic post-ups still result in a lot of shots at the rim and a lot of scoring in the paint. So while yes, the lack of three-point shooting does make one of their biggest weaknesses even weaker, the addition of a high-level slasher to their already awesome paint scoring roster makes one of their biggest strengths even stronger. And while we're talking about adding qualities to the roster that didn't previously exist, what about the transition game? Westbrook remains a big-time threat in the open floor, and he's impacted the pace of each of his teams in a similar manner to their volume of shots at the rim. The numbers I'm about to show you are average seconds per offensive possession, meaning the lower the number, the faster the pace. The Wizards played about a second faster with Russ on the floor. The Lakers 7/10 of a second faster, and the Clippers 9/10 of a second faster. Tenths of seconds might not sound like a lot, but just for some added context, last season the difference between the fastest team in the NBA and just an average pace team was about 9/10 of a second. The Nuggets ranked just 28th on that list, taking over 15 seconds per possession, and if that trend continues of speeding up by almost a second, we could see them a lot closer to the top 10. I actually really like transition play as a counter to less three-point volume. Their team is loaded with great open floor athletes. Christian Braun's explosive and relentless attacking the rim. Peyton Watson's explosive, very lengthy, and can get above the rim with ease. I don't even think I need to explain Aaron Gordon's capability. We all know what he does. But in my opinion, the biggest beneficiary of more pace could actually be the sharpshooting Michael Porter Jr. because of how many more opportunities he'll have to step into transition threes. That's basically his bread and butter, and considering he's already a very high volume outside shooter, maybe he can get up to 8 or 9 attempts a game, replacing some of what's being lost with KCP. As for the half-court game, Westbrook's ability to make plays also unlocks some of their off-ball sets. We know how much Jokic loves to move, cut, and screen all over the court, and having a passer of that caliber to initiate plays allows for more versatility. Maybe we'll see Jamal used as an off-ball weapon more. Maybe we'll see more stuff run for MPJ, another way to increase his three-point volume. And all that's to say, I really like a lot of what Russ brings to the Nuggets as an on-ball creator. The way he pushes pace, his ability to get to the rim, and how his passing allows him to serve as a legitimate initiator adds a few different dimensions to an already remarkable offensive unit. With that in mind though, we also have to acknowledge that he's not gonna all of a sudden be the team's primary creator. Jokic is still option number 1, Jamal is still option number 2, and as long as they're on the floor together, the bulk of the offense is going to be run through that two-man game. Now, what does that mean for Russ? Because, as I said in the beginning, when he's spotted up away from the ball, he's almost always left open, which would only clog up Jamal and Jokic's ability to apply downhill pressure. And my first answer to that question would be that I simply do not know. I'm not in Michael Malone's head. I can't tell you what that coaching staff has in mind, or whether or not he'll even share the floor with those two guys at the same time. What I can tell you though, is that this feels a bit different to me than his last couple of situations. The main reason being, Denver already has an established team-oriented system, meaning they'll be able to put Russ into a specific role instead of this floating question mark. The Lakers never had anything figured out for him, and the result was a complete disaster. And while the Clippers had a more defined place for him, their offense was still incredibly stationary, very isolation heavy, which meant that he was doing a lot of standing around. With more movement, multiple actions, lots of screening and cutting, I feel like it's harder for teams to really exploit Westbrook's lack of outside shooting, especially when he's sharing the floor with a stretch 5 in Jokic. Even if they don't plan to have him in those lineups though, another big factor to consider is the non-Jokic minutes. I don't think it's worth your time to get into the numbers. We all know just how much the Nuggets collapse whenever he sits down. And I'm not going to try to sell you on the idea that Russ will carry the second unit to a positive net rating, just that his own on-ball capabilities could be a nice change of pace and allow for more lineup flexibility. Jamal and Jokic synergize incredibly well when they're playing together, but with no bench creator, they always had to stagger their minutes. Maybe with Russ leading those units, Jokic and Jamal can match up more minutes together, which could take the team to entirely different heights. The overall point I'm trying to make is that because Russ is still such an effective volume creator, the team has more options than ever before. With all of that said though, I still think everyone has to mentally prepare themselves for the possibility that this just simply doesn't pan out. I'm being very optimistic in how I'm approaching this move, and a more pessimistic viewpoint might just end up being reality. If they ask him to carry more on-ball duties, both with starters and bench players, and he starts to exhibit poor shot selection or decision-making, resulting in very low percentage shooting and high turnovers, that nullifies a lot of what I've said from a value standpoint. There's also still a very real possibility that his lack of spacing turns out to be a bigger issue than I'm making it, and he becomes somewhat of a liability against higher level defenses in the playoffs. Because I'll be the first to admit that I was very much on the Clippers hype train with him, making multiple videos on that fit, and when the playoffs rolled around, he basically became unplayable. Like I said though, I feel like LA's ISO heavy offense played a big role in that, so we'll just have to wait and see. I like to stay optimistic, so the way I'm framing it is that as a backup point guard, he can come off the bench and provide a serious spark. High energy, fast pace, breaking down the defense with his rim pressure and getting the best out of not only Denver's role players, but the 3-time MVP in the middle. And in addition to all of those potentially great qualities, everyone seems to be overlooking what he can do defensively. He has his flaws, like he's been known to fall asleep pretty consistently, maybe he'll get caught ball watching, or miss a rotation, botch a switch. The mental aspects of team defense aren't exactly his strong suit. However, there are a few strengths that can bring serious value if used properly. For one, he's elite in rear pursuit, chasing ball handlers from behind and making plays. Compare that to KCP, who's great at getting around screens and staying attached to the ball, a much more sound point of attack defender. The thing is, KCP's style of defense is maximized with a great drop big, and Jokic is anything but that. I'd actually argue that a chasing defender can at times be more impactful when it comes to protecting a weaker drop big, and it potentially offers a little bit more coverage versatility. I'd love to see Malone use a playbook like Tom Thibodeau. Lots of ice, some drop, some hedging and trapping, mix it up and create a lot of chaos, because that's where Russ thrives as an on-ball defender. Away from the ball, like I said, he's not great when it comes to awareness or activity, but his size, length, and athleticism still go a long way. He covers the gaps well, has decent anticipation for jumping passing lanes, which fits beautifully into the style of defense they like to run, with lots of aggressive helping, shifting across the court, and zoning up shooters to mitigate advantages created by the initial action. I wouldn't be surprised if they got noticeably worse defensively after losing KCP, but I also wouldn't be surprised if replacing Reggie Jackson with Russell Westbrook makes a lot of those minutes look like a completely different defensive animal. Like I keep saying, only time will tell. There's only one more point I'd like to make, and I know I prefer to keep these videos exclusive to what's happening on the court. As an avid user of social media though, I can't help but notice what shows up on my timeline. We aren't in the locker room, so there's only so much we can get from posts, and they might be cherry picked, but everything I've seen suggests that the vibes with Russ are immaculate. From karaoke in Abu Dhabi, to practice highlights, to the way Michael Malone talks about him in interviews, I get the idea that everyone's on the same page. And Russ alongside DeAndre Jordan is some pretty awesome veteran presence. If nothing else, I'll leave you with that. There's a ton to think about on offense and defense, and we won't know if the team got better or worse until we see them in action throughout the season. But I couldn't be more excited to see how it turns out. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to drop a like, subscribe, and turn my post notifications on to be first on more content. If you're interested in my more in-depth research, make sure to check out my website and social media profiles. You can find those links in the description. Feel free to let me know down in the comments what you think of the Nuggets. As always, I hope you all have a great day, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.